Well, once more, good evening. And I'd like to again invite you to take out your Bibles, be turning along with me to the book of 2 Samuel and chapter 2. 2 Samuel chapter 2, we will be there together in just a few minutes. Again, this being our last night, I just want to express my thanks. This week has really flown by for me, and I'm anxious to get back home, of course, and see family and brethren back there, but I really wish we had just a little bit more time to spend with y'all, and I hope that this has been a good week for you. Y'all been very kind to my wife and myself, and very complimentary and enthusiastic about the lessons. I will say, though, you need to be careful that you mix in at least some neutral feedback and you don't inflate with all positive feedback. When I first started preaching, we were supported fully on the outside, and so once a year at least I'd kind of do a tour of all the congregations who supported us, and the first place we preached at the end of it, someone got up and said, "Oh, the scriptures have been rightly divided this day," and went on. And the next place I preached, one of the elders got up at the end of the services, "Our brother has broken unto us this day the bread of life." And I said, "Yeah, okay, I'm doing pretty good." And I go to another congregation. And this one was in a little bit more rarefied air. And by that I mean it was on top of the mountain where they raised pigs. And a brother was preaching at the end of the service, and he said, "And Lord, I appreciate the lesson that this young feller gave this morning. I don't really remember what his name was, but he did a pretty good job." And so you need to have someone in the church who can kind of even out all of the compliments. So somebody, you need to step up and be that person. Just again, without bitterness. This evening, we're really going to be looking at one character, as we've been doing the previous nights. And yet, while we're going to be talking about Joab, the lesson that we're going to draw from his life is not just about the ways in which he was bitter per se, but we're going to be drawing out some lessons on how situations can go wrong and how they can really get worse when we don't take the time to stop and properly work through the problems that we might have. And in fact, really the problems that come about when we try to move forward and either pretend or act as though everything has been healed, everything is fine, without actually allowing people time to mend. Now, if you don't remember who Joab is, we'll just remind you that he was the commander of King David's armies. And as such, he's a fairly central figure in the life of David. And he's a very strong, very boisterous, charismatic character. But usually we're not talking about Joab within the context of David's mighty men as they will be cataloged toward the end of Samuel and Chronicles. Those are people who served, we might say, with honor and dignity. And when we think about Joab, we think of someone who is a very violent man, even among men of war, someone who was very difficult, to say the least, more of a problem to be dealt with. But I think as with any historical character, to really understand their life, we have to see the ways in which they were also a product of their time, a product of their environment. David's reign over Israel began during a time of great division. There was a lot of strife that was present amongst the people of God. And all of that would continue to be punctuated by periods of disunity times where the peace of the land was going to be disrupted. And it's within a context like that we are introduced to Joab as a character. And honestly, that's usually the case anytime that we see Joab in the story of David. It's going to be within that context of strife and disruption and peace being threatened. Joab first comes about in 1 Samuel 26 and verse 6, and that is within the context of his brother Abishai urging David to take action against Saul as he slept. But Joab really comes in as a character in his own right in chapter 2 of 2 Samuel. At this point in the text, King Saul has already died. He's fallen in battle. But it's not as though when Saul dies, everyone is just rushing to get behind David, and now we're going to make him our king. You really have a period of civil war. And so you have a man named Abner, and he is the leader of the pro-Saul coalition. And then you have Joab, who has taken his place as the leader of David's armies. And they meet up at the pool of Gibeon. And in chapter 2 and verse 14, they begin what we might just call a wrestling match, just a contest between the armies to, I suppose, try and blow off some steam, let off some tension, but there was entirely too much tension, and it very quickly escalates. You have 24 people die, and then an all-out battle begins. Well, David's forces are clearly the ones who have an upper hand, and so Abner begins to flee. Well, every step of the way, Abner is being pursued by a man named Asahel. And so in 2 Samuel chapter 2, and beginning in verse 18, we read, "Now the 3 sons of Zeruiah were there, Joab and Abishai and Asahel. And Asahel was as swift-footed as one of the gazelles which is in the field. And Asahel pursued Abner and did not turn to the right or to the left from following Abner. Then Abner turned to look behind him and said, 'Is that you, Asahel?' And he answered, 'It is I.' So Abner said to him, 'Turn to your right or to your left and seize one of the young men for yourself and take for yourself his spoil.' But Asahel was not willing to turn aside from following him. And Abner repeated again to Asahel, 'Turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How then could I lift up my face to your brother Joab?' However, he refused to turn aside. Therefore Abner struck him in the belly with the butt end of the spear, so that the spear came out at his back, and he fell there and died on the spot. And it happened that all who came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died stood still." Let's pause there in the text for a moment. You know what? I don't like partial PowerPoints, so I'm going to use executive authority and just blast that thing out of here. So, in the text that we're looking at, I think it should be pretty obvious that if Abner had been able to choose, he didn't want to kill Asahel. He understood that doing so was something that would have caused more division in the nation. He certainly understood that it would have caused problems between himself and Joab. But you have Asahel very determined to follow in spite of the warnings that he was given, and so he dies. He pays with his life. Now, in the following chapter, we read about Abner having something of a falling out with the house of Saul. And so he decides he's going to split ways with Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and make peace with David. And while there are some conditions that are placed on that peace, by and large, David is willing, he's even eager to try and sue for peace. And so in 2 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 20, Abner and 20 men came with him to David at Hebron, and David made a feast for Abner and the men who were with him. And Abner said to him, "Let me arise and go and gather all Israel to my lord the king, that they may cut a covenant with you, and that you may be king over all that your soul desires." So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. And so you have a gathering here after the difficulty that has arisen, and then you have people walking away from it, and everyone is operating under the assumption that everything is well, that peace has been made, and now it's time for us to move on. Except, let us remember Joab. Joab, whose brother has been killed by the very man who's just come to David and has requested that peace be made between their houses. And after Abner has come and gone, and Joab learns about his whereabouts, he decides that he is going to take action. And so in the same chapter, but now in verse 26, then Joab came out from David and sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the well of Sirah, but David did not know it. So when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside in the middle of the gate to speak with him privately, and there he struck him in the belly so that he died on account of the blood of Asahel, his brother. Now let's pause there for a moment. I think that there are certain characteristics about who Joab is that we begin to learn here, but for the moment, all I really want you to take from this occasion is that you have an incident where David tries to make peace, but he tries to make peace without any regard for addressing the underlying issues that had caused the conflict in the first place. And so because of this, his attempt at peace collapses in the worst spectacular way possible, almost as instantly as it had began. Unfortunately, that's not going to be the last time that Israel has division. And it's not even going to be the last time that it involves Joab. If we turn forward just a little bit to chapter 14. As you're turning there, we'll establish just a little bit of context for what we're looking at. You may recall that later on in David's reign, well after he has already been set up as king over all of Israel, the king's son Absalom is banished for taking justice into his own hands and taking the life of his half-brother Amnon. Joab, in that case, is actually the one who convinces King David to bring Absalom back from his exile. But if you remember that story, you may recall that even after bringing Absalom back, David does not actually address the issues with his son. And so Absalom spends 2 whole years in Jerusalem without ever getting to see his father David. And he eventually gets tired of waiting. And he reasons to himself, well, if Joab helped me once before, he can probably help me again. And so he sends for Joab once, he sends for him twice, and for whatever reason, Joab refuses to answer. And so Absalom decides, if he won't talk to me, I'm going to have to get his attention the hard way. And so in chapter 14 of 2 Samuel, and beginning in verse 28, now Absalom lived 2 full years in Jerusalem and did not see the king's face. Then Absalom sent for Joab to send him to the king, but he was not willing to come to him, so he sent again a second time, but he was not willing to come. Therefore he said to his servants, "See, a portion of land is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire." So Absalom's servants set the portion of the land on fire. Then Joab arose, came to Absalom at his house, and said to him, "Why have your servants set my portion of land on fire?" And Absalom answered Joab, "Behold, I sent for you, saying, 'Come here, that I may send you to the king to say, Why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me still to be there. So now let me see the king's face, and if there is iniquity in me, let him put me to death.' So Joab came to the king and told him, and he called for Absalom. Thus he came to the king and prostrated himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. Now let's pause there in the text for a moment. We're going to summarize some of the events that follow, but for now, sort of tuck this encounter in the back of our minds. We have a very similar situation. We have disunity, we have division in the house of David, and now we have peace. Absalom's been restored, but none of the underlying issues have been addressed. And at the top of that list is the issue of Absalom himself. In the months that follow, Absalom enacts a plan to steal away the loyalty of Israel and lead a full-on rebellion against David. I feel a little bit like we might be doing one of those old Disney VHS sing-alongs. Can we get a mouse to bounce with the words behind me? All right. Hot diggity dog. There we go. Okay. So, Absalom's brought back in, yet things are really not well. It's just a surface level cure. And so Absalom decides he's going to once again take things into his own hands, and he rebels against his father David. Now again, you might recall that at first Absalom is very successful in those endeavors. People follow after him. David is driven out of the city of Jerusalem. You have many key figures who defect to Absalom's side, and he is almost victorious. But eventually, the tide begins to turn. And you have a point where there's going to be a decisive battle between David's forces and Absalom's forces. And David wishes to spare the life of his son Absalom. And so he gives explicit instructions in chapter 18 and verse 5 for Joab and others to do Absalom no harm. Again, overtures are made for peace. Again, underlying issues are ignored. So the battle commences, the forces of Absalom are routed, and we find the enemy trying to flee once again. You'll recall Absalom in his haste becomes entangled in the branches of an oak tree, and the report comes to Joab, and the following conversation unfolds in chapter 18 and verse 10. Speaking of Absalom in the tree, it says, "Then a certain man saw it. He told Joab and said, 'Behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak.' Then Joab said to the man who had told him, 'Now behold, you saw him. Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? And I would have given you 10 pieces of silver and a belt.' So the man said to Joab, 'Even if I should receive 1,000 pieces of silver in my hand, I would not set forth my hand against the king's son, for in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, Keep for me the young man Absalom. Otherwise, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there is nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof.' Then Joab said, 'I will not wait around here before you.' So he took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through the heart of Absalom while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak. And 10 young men who carried Joab's armor gathered around and struck Absalom and put him to death." Let's pause there in the text. I think that if we're just sort of speaking politically, then we could say that there's a certain amount of practicality that you could read into Joab's actions. You have the character of Absalom, and he has committed treason amongst other crimes. He was the one who had led opposing armies. He had caused the death of many Israelites in doing so. And if he had been allowed to live, he probably would have been a continual thorn in the side of David. But I don't think that we can attribute all of these things to Joab just being a very, wise, level-headed man. I think that the fella in verse 13 really has a good grasp on the situation. He knows that Joab wants Absalom dead for personal reasons. And if he could have Absalom killed and then pin the blame on someone else, then that would have been even better. I want to point out the brutality of the murder in verses 14 and 15 to underscore that point. Now, I just finished reading again the book, the Iliad. I don't know how many of you have read that, but there comes a point where the great hated enemy of the Greeks, Hector, is slain, and they take his body and they put it behind the chariot and they just drag it around, and everyone has the opportunity to poke with the spear. And here you have Absalom hanging in the tree, completely incapacitated, and Joab comes and puts 3 spears through his heart, allows all of these men to come. 10 young men gather around him, and if he's not already dead, they put him to death. Such a gruesome, grisly scene, not some kind of execution of real justice. And so again, I want you to carry away from the text that for a second time, David has tried to force a peace on his people without addressing any of the core issues. And for a second time, it has ended in terrible violence. Now, I want to look at one more incident before we start making some specific applications. This happens almost immediately afterwards in the text, but again, we need a little bit of context. Earlier, when Absalom takes the reins of power, one of the first things that he does is to change out all of the officials that he assumed were still going to be loyal to David with men who would be loyal to himself. And so that, of course, includes removing Joab from the commander of the armies, and in his place, he appoints a man named Amasa. Now, if you've ever been unceremonially dismissed from a position, it's insulting enough to have to deal with the person who took your job. 2 Samuel 17:25 lets us know that in addition to that, Amasa is a relative of Joab's, one who it seems does not have the most honorable of lineages, perhaps being illegitimately born. And so you have a situation that is already tense, to say the least, and it is made even more so through this extra layer of familial strife. So, following David's victory and the death of Absalom, David is once again very eager to try to make peace, to have a quick resolution and put an end to the conflict. And in chapter 19 and starting in verse 12, David extends an olive branch to the elders of the cities who had joined Absalom in rebellion. But he also sees this as an opportunity to maybe move, or remove rather, one of the most troublesome elements in his rule, Joab. So in 2 Kings chapter 19 and in verse 12, he's speaking to the tribes who had wandered away from him. He says, "You are my brothers, you are my bone and my flesh. Why then should you be the last to have the king return? Say to Amasa, are you not my bone and my flesh? May God do so to me and more also, if you will not be commander of the army before me continually in the place of Joab." I like how one writer, in talking about this text, describes it. He said that Joab does not brook rivals, so Amasa's tenure was brief. And if you turn just perhaps one page over in your Bible, in chapter 20 and verse 8, they were at the large stone which is in Gibeon, and Amasa came to meet them. Now Joab was dressed in his military attire, and over it was a belt, and with a sword in its sheath fastened at his waist, and as he came out, it fell out. Then Joab said to Amasa, "Is it well with you, my brother?" And Joab took Amasa by the beard with his right hand to kiss him. But Amasa was not on guard against the sword which was in Joab's hand, so he struck him in the belly with it and poured out his inward parts on the ground and did not strike him again, and he died. Now let me pause right there. These are three terrible circumstances. And the picture that I want you to get from them is that David's reign, again, was punctuated by these great periods of tension and division among God's people. And Israel, as a group, seemed to move past these divisions, but they seldom did so very well. The core issues that were the causes of the problems were left unresolved, and people just sort of seemed to be satisfied to, well, let's just get back to normal as quickly as we can. And as a result of just a surface level reconciliation, whenever you had the potential for a division to arise, it usually did. Joab provides us with an example of that on an individual level. While others assumed that peace was going to be accomplished, he had unresolved bitterness, he had resentment that waited for the opportunity to break forth. And Joab is a testimony to the fact that you cannot have real or meaningful peace with any group of people if you do not allow wounds to heal properly. Now, this is the portion of the lesson where we're going to transition to make some points. Let me emphasize, I don't need this PowerPoint. This has abandoned me. The keyboard has abandoned me. Like Psalm 88 ends, you have removed from me lover and friend. All of my friends are darkness. But what I don't want to happen is that we get to the invitation song later on, and this thing is still frozen up, and everyone's having to scramble for their songbooks. So this is kind of like the intermission. Don't try and restore it. Cast it out from me. Remove it from mine presence, outside of the camp. But just make sure that your songs are where they need to be. All right. Intermission comes to a close, and we've all gotten our popcorn. Now we're back in our seats, ready for part 2 of Fiddler on the Roof. So, this congregation, being the same as every other congregation in that it is made up of people, it is made up of people with varying backgrounds, varying levels of understanding, will no doubt have had to have worked through its own share of tension. It has had to do so in the past, and it will most likely have to do so again in the future. That is not unique. That is not something that sets you apart as a congregation that has something wrong with it. All churches have growing pains. We might even say they just have existing pains. But whenever those tensions arise, we need to understand that there is a real danger in trying to move on without an understanding that wounds take time to heal. And we can also assume something of a very fragile and a very brittle surface level peace where underlying issues are left unresolved. And so it's important that we understand that all of those things that we've talked about in our previous lessons on overcoming and dealing and guarding against bitterness, all of those things involve principles that have to be practiced over time. Reconciliation, in its truest sense, is only accomplished by people who are committed to working on their relationships over a sustained period. In other words, healing and reconciliation is not a one-time event. I remember an incident where there were some things that were said between brethren in a different congregation. And it was very hurtful, and it was very widely known, and it affected many families. And some people thought, well, the thing to do is, in order to address this, we're just going to have a conversation with the church, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But they had a conversation with the church, lasted about 45 minutes, and then afterwards the statement was made with kind of a clapping of the hands. Well, I'm glad that's behind us. Sometimes you just need to talk about something. And I kind of stood there incredulous that anyone could think that you could have a situation that was complex and involved so many people being hurt, and just a quick little chat got everybody to where they needed to be. Everything's healed, everything's fine, and yet that's the way a lot of people deal with a lot of relationships. Our determination to move past an issue has to be paired with a determination to dedicate ourselves to fully and completing addressing any given issue. And it's only then can people accomplish healing with both grace and completion. You know, I can never pretend to know how any individual may be impacted by any given disruption to peace. But I do think that there are some common areas that tend to go unresolved following conflicts. Common areas that we could see in the story of Joab, common areas that you could probably observe in your own interactions. And so I want us to consider 3 attitudes that we can check as we continue to talk about introspection and self-examination. These are similar to some questions we asked the other night, but we're going to elaborate on them a little bit more. And the first thing that I think I need to ask following any sort of disruption to peace is, do I have the right attitude toward my brethren? And particularly, what I mean by this is that I cannot afford to carry emotional baggage from one incident with me into another. I have to be very careful about how I allow conflict to shape my image of my brethren. And if you don't understand what I mean by that, think of someone with whom you have butted heads, and after that is resolved, has your attitude changed about them in any degree? Do you not find yourself thinking, well, the next time I have a conversation, I know not to say this, or I know not to bring up this, or I suspect that they may act this way. And we carry those things with us so that when we have a conversation the next time, we say in the back of our minds, well, I remember how they were last time, and we expect them to be that way again. This is how I expect them to react moving forward. We begin to say, well, you know how they are. I have to be very careful that I give as much grace as possible toward the actions of other people. Whatever my concerns may be, I have 2 options. I can either address those concerns directly with an individual, or I can decide that this is something that I can simply let go, that it falls into those categories of what Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 13, those things which love can bear or endure. The option that I do not have is to carry my issues forward with me into the next event. A couple of nights ago, maybe it was last night, some of us were talking about green stamps and all the cool things that you used to be able to buy with green stamps. These were reward points that stores would give you. You could fill up your book, then go cash it in. Well, there's a whole theory of social interaction that goes around that. You take an insult from somebody, it's a stamp, you put it in your book. Someone crosses you, you take it, you put it in your book, and you wait until you filled up your book. You haven't said anything to your brother or sister, but the day comes when you're ready to cash it in. And they've crossed you, and you slam it down, and here is everything that you've ever done wrong. I've been saving them up for this day. That is not an option. And so, in addition to asking how I feel about my brethren, I have to ask, following any conflict, do I have a right view of church leadership? I think that if, sometimes kids like to ask each other, if you could have any superpower, what would it be? I think that if church elders could have any superpower, it would be the ability to just stop time, to just pause everything so they could have as much time as they wanted and needed to talk and figure out how to address an issue. Unfortunately for them, elders don't have the ability to stop time. The world keeps moving, and elders have to respond to events as they unfold in real time. And they have to do that knowing that they bear an enormous responsibility. And so they react to things the best they can with the resources that they have been given. And brethren must be exceedingly careful not to fall into the trap of saying, well, I would have done that differently. Well, Monday morning quarterback, I'm sure you would have. Hindsight is 20/20, as they say. Leaders learn and improve over time. Leaders do not spring forth from the forehead of God like some sort of Greek mythological creature completely formed, and they just do everything right. Well, if you think that elders can do better, you're probably not thinking any differently from what they do. They think that they could do better, and they try to do better. You've got to be very careful not to walk away from conflict with unresolved feelings toward your leaders as well, because you will carry that into the future, and that will warp your perspective of events in a way that does not accurately reflect reality. And finally, I have to ask whether I have the right attitude toward the church as a whole. In any congregation, it's very easy to kind of do like we did, speaking of Korah the other night. You just start keeping tally of all of the things that have gone wrong, all the bad events, whether those are big or small. And you look back and say, well, we had this happen, and this happened, and begin to develop something of a disillusioned and discouraged attitude that the church is somehow not all it's cracked up to be. Over time, an image is constructed in one's mind that does not match what the church truly is. The thing about the church, a thing about the church that is so wonderful, is that the mistakes and the missteps of individuals, regardless of how many those may be, those do not in any way fundamentally alter the nature of the church that Jesus built and that Jesus purchased. The church as a whole that exists outside of or throughout time, past, present, and future, cannot be stained or tarnished by the mistakes of any given individual. It is immortal and beyond the reach of the mistakes that we might make along the way. Now, having said that, the church is made up of people, and so that means that on a local level there will always be problems. But the growth and the maturity that comes as a result of a church working through those problems does not take away from the beauty of the church. If anything, it only adds to it or brings it out and makes it all the more noticeable. I want you to take away from this lesson those 3 points summarized as follows. You cannot have peace without allowing time for wounds to heal. That's going to be different for every person, but we all need to make sure that those wounds are being tended to. And so you have to resolve to resolve. Don't let problems linger. Don't let grudges stay. If you have divides, address those with brethren and determine to achieve real, meaningful peace by working together to make sure that those hurts are healed to a point of grace and completion. You know, we have ended each evening by calling attention to the fact that this peace, this unity that we speak of, is something that can only be found in Christ. That certainly hasn't changed. And so we continue and we conclude this evening by once again calling our attention to it. And if you haven't yet obeyed the gospel and you want real meaningful peace in your life, something that allows you to relinquish those feelings of bitterness and anger, those things that are promoted by the world, then you can submit to Christ, be baptized, have your sins forgiven. You can receive prayers from the brethren here to help and encourage you. And so if you need to do any of those things tonight, the invitation is yours as we get ready to stand and sing together.